Welcome to today's webinar, Design Build Bluff, a concern for usefulness. The webinar today is brought to you by Open Architecture Collaborative, the American Institute of Architects Housing Knowledge Community, and EDI International. I'm Steve Schreiber from UMass Amherst, and I'll be the moderator of today's webinar. Our presenter today is Jose Galarza, who is the director of the Design Build Bluff, a graduate architecture program at the University of Utah, which focuses on immersing students in a hands-on cross-cultural experience in partnership with the Navajo community of San Juan County in the Utah Four Corners. The learning objectives for the webinar are to understand some of the equity issues surrounding access to safe and healthy housing for Native American populations, specifically within the Navajo Nation, to learn how community engagement is central to architecture practice, and to learn how cultural survival influences architectural design and space making, and to describe some basic passive design technologies that help to limit utility use for off-grid housing. The full course description is on the slide in front of you. In essence, today we'll learn how a group of graduate architecture students and faculty have engaged with the Navajo communities of the Utah Four Corners region to build capacity through full-scale architectural projects. So a few words about logistics. So Jose will speak until about quarter of, and then we'll be available to answer questions. So those of you participating in the webinar, if you have questions along the way, please submit the questions in the chat box, which looks like the image on the slide there. And we will curate the questions and then ask your questions of Jose at the end of the webinar. This is the mandatory copyright statement and the mandatory compliance statement. So please join me in welcoming Jose Galarza.
Hello, everybody. This is Jose, and I've changed the title slightly of this presentation. I think current events warrant it a little bit. So the title now is The Future of Community Engagement, Renewing the Capacity of Indigenous Communities to Serve Themselves. I'm going to talk briefly a little bit about a program that I direct at the University of Utah. It's called DesignBuildBLUFF. But before I do that, I want to talk a little bit quickly about some things that ground our teaching in this program. So as I said, we teach at the U of U, and the university as a whole has these main four strategic objectives, and so I've highlighted two here that I think have strong influence in our teaching. So the first one I've highlighted there is promote student success, and the second one I've highlighted is engage communities. And then of course within our College of Architecture and Planning we have additionally 4 commitments, again with my highlights for sustainability, community resilience, respect for the health and culture of all places, and the promotion of innovation through collaborative modes of practice. So when I think about our teaching, and this is not just for me as the director of Design Build Bluff, but many of my colleagues actually who teach in other programs that engage students in hands-on ways or in the landscape that is this beautiful state. These are some 4 lenses that we typically use. So again, one, we really see our college as prominently trying to engage students through community engaged learning. Additionally, developing resilient practices, authentic learning experiences, and using landscape as a teaching tool. Jumped ahead here. So community engaged learning is really just developing a sensitivity within our students for real-world experiences, interacting with real clients. This is really crucial for us. Additionally, thinking beyond just the razor's edge of what sustainability is, and thinking more about resiliency of communities, that it doesn't have just necessarily a building performance metric, but it also has a social component as well. Again, giving students that hands-on, real-world, authentic learning experience, signature experiences, we also call them. And then because we live in such a unique environment, this Mountain West range has a lot of great opportunity for using that landscape as a unique teaching tool. So speaking more specifically about Design Build Bluff, here's our mission and vision statement. Again, I've highlighted for you this term applied research. So let me talk really quickly about what I mean by that. So, in higher education, there tends to be a bias for conceptual thinking away from what's sometimes called technical thinking. So here I'm demonstrating that through the icon of a bias of brain over hand. And, my funny joke here is that in high school we have this dichotomy between kind of the nerds and jocks, or that tension that exists. And in architecture practice, we know that similar kind of tension that exists between contractors and designers. So, the question of design build is a little bit about how can we make the combination of those two things, not just for economic sense, but to produce better buildings. And it seems like this trend is something that is been for the last few years, especially after the moment of crisis after 2008, has been kind of a continual urgency that's been happening within different universities across the country. This was a while back ago, 2013. You can see the Chronicle for Higher Education published this article that was looking at a few different universities that were doing hands-on. And we can go as far back as Black Mountain College here in the United States, which was using the John Dewey model of pedagogy that was talking about learning by doing. And the Black Mountain was really about creating kind of citizen, students that would go out into the world and actually be productive members of society. So we find that in these moments of crises, design, build, hands-on, technical, they want to marry a little bit more with the conceptual. And so the context that we work in as Design Build Bluff is within Native American communities, and more historically with the Navajo Nation. So where is the Navajo Nation? Let me tell you a little bit about the history of our program and sort of how we arrived where we are. So our program was founded in the year 2000 by Hank Lewis, and then he purchased a property in the area of Bluff, which is in the Four Corners region of Utah, and then in 2004 the program moved to Bluff. I think Hank was a little bit inspired, as the folklore goes, by the Rural Studio, which many of you probably know, and decided that he wanted to do something like that to serve his own community. The program existed historically as an independent nonprofit, and then in 2003 became an official program of the University of Utah, which coincided with my hire as the director. And we continued to build upon those original foundings. So to give you a sense of the region, that area in blue on this slide is the Navajo Nation. It's the largest Native American nation in this country. And as you can see, it occupies 3 separate states, most of it in Arizona and New Mexico. But that little yellow dot is the region that we work in, which is in the Four Corners again. So Navajo Nation is comprised of 110 chapters. They have governance much like we do nationally. They have a president and a vice president, which is in Window Rock. And then each one of these individual chapters, or like towns or counties, they govern tribally within those specific regions. So in Utah we have 7 of these, and of those 7, we work with about I'd say 3 or 4 of those, and that just has to do with proximity. So to give you a further sense here, this is just a diagram talking about the different projects that we've done over the years. This diagram only goes up until it looks like about 2011, but that's pretty much the region in which we work. To give you kind of a visual idea, this is the Comb Ridge. This is our backyard. So aside from the incredible learning experience that students get, it's an amazing opportunity to explore the landscape again of that region. So, I usually like to when I do a talk like this, give a sense for successes and failures. I like to be as transparent as possible. And this is an article that a colleague and I had written, and so I'll be at moments pulling out some excerpts from that article. But so talking just about the successes, again, it's incredible hands-on experience. I think for most students, they describe it as the most transformative experience of their academic career, and it's hands-on, it's engaged. Students are additionally AmeriCorps members, so they get that opportunity of doing service aside from the learning experience. So here are all the students wearing their AmeriCorps shirts. We try to get them as much as possible and in advance of actually working with the community, some kind of cultural grounding. So we oftentimes bring Native consultants, teachers, elders to give our students some sense of background for the culture, but also for how they might think about the work that they're doing. Additionally, more recently, we have started to do community-engaged learning reflections where students are asked to think about things like bias or privilege, and this is the kind of curriculum they're actually hoping to develop vertically from undergraduate years through the graduate years. Again, DesignBuildBLUFF is right now strictly a graduate program, but we are feeling strongly that the lessons learned from that program can have implications elsewhere. Aside from that, students do everything from scratch to finish, whether it's the design or the construction. They're working with consultants, in this case, to do lighting. They're obviously working on a full construction set of drawings and models. Typical kind of studio presentation. The design studio right now happens in the fall, and then the build happens in the spring. So in that springtime, students converge for initial, safety protocols and just general the culture of how we live together on the campus. So here's just a kind of a quick breakdown. You can see in that 2016 mark, each one of those little blue boxes that says 3 weeks on it is associated with a different aspect of the construction. So we basically go for every month 3 weeks on and 1 week off. And each one of those phases represents a different phase of construction. Again, they do everything from foundation to structure, utilities, all the way to finishes. Of course, at moments when necessary, we bring on engineers and consultants to help us ensure health, safety, and welfare. So just some more images again to give you a sense of the students in action. I'm blowing in some dense packed cellulose there, building some stair treads, communing together over lunch, and just hanging out. Aside from that, we have some supplemental courses, a sketch course in this case, students going to some sacred sites, which there are many in the region, as well as some of our previous DesignBuildBLUFF sites to do some rendering of what they're seeing. So jumping now into our projects, over the years we've done over 20 projects, at this point engaged over 300 students, and recorded many volunteer hours through AmeriCorps. A lot of people want to know typically what the cost of the building is, and so what I tell people who are interested in that, and also of course what I tell my students is, the student group, I think of them very much like a startup, and we're giving them some initial capital, and that capital is about $25K. Additionally, we've shored up some in-kind donations, so the full value of the houses ends up being more like $50,000. But again, this previous diagram here from 2012 to 2016 is giving a sense to students of how much they might spend on whatever emphasis they want to put in the architectural project. So you can see different namings here of where students have decided to put that emphasis. And just talking a little bit again about sort of financials. Well, on the left you'll see again a little bit of the project. So this was last year's Cedar Hall project. And again, you can see that the in-kind donation exceeds the cash expense. The total value is again sort of around that $50,000 or $60,000 number. In terms of our internal funding, most of it comes from donations and grants. The student fees really only go to support their teaching and housing and board. Otherwise, all of the housing costs comes from external sources. So we're just going to quickly run through a couple of projects. I'm not going to belabor too much the detailing. Feel free to ask me questions about that afterwards. I just want to talk more broadly about the different approaches that we've taken to the projects and how we've kind of learned over the years. So this was a project that we did in collaboration with the University of Colorado in Denver, and this was before the kind of most recent transition from the nonprofit to the program. This is by far probably one of the projects that we're most noted for. There was that New York Times article that you saw previously. It's the project that we get the most question on for details. It's a fantastic one. It's long sort of east to west, which prioritizes solar gain, and it's got some interesting ideas for how to create bedroom space, which space in our projects generally comes at a kind of tension between how we can fit other aspects of rooms and program into the building. Because we're typically limited at around 800 square feet. This project's a little bit bigger, but that's what we've now set our ambition on, so we can make sure to be done on time and on budget. But so the fun kind of thing that's going on here is that the beds are actually stored within a bookcase, so we can see some sense of that here. Yeah, so all the rooms are kind of, again, just sort of hidden behind that bookcase. And just really simple open floor plan. And here's the client there, Lorraine Nakai. Again, big, tall, glazing moments all across the building, which I think, again, is what intrigues a lot of outsiders. Some detail views of that, some sections, I mean, some elevations. So I want to focus your attention on the left elevation and that big glazing moment, that bay window. And so, one thing that we've learned, from projects like these is some appreciation of the cultural background. And so this is an image of what's called a skinwalker. So this is a kind of a black magic. And so there has been some current concern that we've found that with those big modern glazing that we tend to like from our architectural perspective sometimes aren't totally conducive to our client. I think it was a perfect solution for Lorraine, but this is a different project where we found that those glazing moments were being covered by curtains. And so we had to reflect in that moment and say, okay, are we doing the best thing for the client culturally, or are we just trying to import our own kind of detailing that we think would be better? So this has been kind of an ongoing conversation. So the next project I want to talk about is Sol Rose. This is a client who found out only a year before we encountered her that she was about to be paralyzed. She was in a severe accident, and we had to immediately respond to that. And so that helped ground us, though, in kind of the bigger issue, which is that right now Native American populations face the highest level of disability at 22%, and that's an older survey, but still it's generally true. These are some of the injuries or disabilities that we find. And of course, when you're living in a really rural environment, and especially if you're wheelchair bound, access to appropriate housing is really difficult. And so again, I think we set for ourselves this idea of wanting to exceed accessibility for this specific client, but also to teach us for future projects. This was her situation. She was living in a single wide that was raised about 3 feet off the ground, which again made it completely inaccessible to her. But you'll notice in this image a really beautiful site. You can see Monument Valley in the center there, off in the distance. And so the student solution here was to try to create a situation where the client could be both indoors and outdoors relatively easily, and that her indoor situation would be as functional as possible. And so this is the idea then of this kind of ambulatory that goes from the indoors to the outdoors, with the opportunity to be able to partake of those beautiful landscape features, which are, I would mention, culturally very important to Navajo of this region. So here's kind of a quick floor plan. North is to the left. Entrance for all Navajo housing should really be on the east door, which is the number 1 in this floor plan. But as you can see, big open plan with some slight partition for her and her son. So all the counter surface is really intended for her to be able to pull completely underneath it. All of the drawers are full extension. And here's just a look, outdoor oven, trellis, and a low sloping sidewalk that doesn't require a rail. Some local shading on this face here, trellis. Again, you can see that outdoor oven, interior masonry heater, rammed earth wall. Again, you see full extension drawers with side access and pull bars in the bathroom. The shower is, of course, just sloped from the concrete slab, trench drain in the back there. Some additional images. Again, a closet that's at her height. And there's the client there, Juanita Joe, on the day of the ceremony. So adding to these lessons learned, aside from the accessibility and that sort of brief conversation about glazing, I think we've started more and more to expand our idea of community engagement to really include building the capacity of Indigenous communities to serve themselves. I think we really want to make sure that what we're not doing is importing our idea of how people should be living, but should be facilitating those. I think the existing tension, as highlighted by this quote here, is that if we just sort of go in there blindly, we run this risk of not appreciating that the reason why our community might be having the trouble that it does to facilitate its own needs might be because of some historical forces. And so we want to be really cognizant of that and teach our students about that as much as anything else. Because the truth is that the Navajo historically have a strong tradition for architecture, so it's not necessarily what they need is more design or designers, but it's as much the need to have access to resources. So, but just speaking quickly about the culture, this is a really nice cosmological diagram for the house. So when you or I typically go into our dwelling, it's just, 4 walls and a roof. But for the Navajo, it actually has a much deeper symbology that touches epistemological needs as much as they do the practical needs of shelter. So not to give you the whole history of Navajo architecture, but this is a really nice diagram. Again, the east is facing on the bottom of this plan here, but this is the general hogan. You walk in from the east and then you ambulate, at least in terms of ritual, clockwise, moving from left to right. And on the north side, that's the female side, which predominates most of the floor plan, and on the southern side is the male side. Here are some images of some of those typologies. So that the top left and to the bottom right, we see a very sort of typical female hogan, of which there is a male and a female. And then the bottom left there you see a shade structure, which is a seasonal structure, especially for the summer. The sleeping does happen in there. And then missing from these are the sweat lodge. So those are the 4 representative architecture typologies, which could be broken down further into 8 typologies. And so why is this idea of culture important? So there have been a lot of studies recently that have talked about the loss of language, and language being an indicator of culture is sort of the canary in the coal mine, right? So we understand that within the next 100 years, we could have a loss of culture of about 90%, meaning that we have about 7,000 languages that were recorded at the beginning of this century, and that by the end of that century, we might have only about 700. So this is devastating because we understand, of course, that culture, that diversity of a culture is what makes us great, but it also gives us some understanding for how we view the world. So I think it's pretty well appreciated that Native Americans have a strong sense of connection to nature, and there's a kind of an idea of sustainability that we can learn from that, even as non-natives. And so this crisis of language and this crisis of culture is finding right now currently some additional conflict. Again, as I said, Navajo Nation has a president, and just recently a new one was elected in 2014, and there was some issue about one of the candidates not being able to be fluent in Navajo, which disallowed him from actually running. So again, the critical reflection for us and for our students is how can we create spaces that are supportive of that preservation of culture. And it's not so much about sequestering culture as this kind of this localized, bordered-in kind of identity. We want to allow for contemporary identity to exist, but within that larger culture. So I think it's as much about creating those capacities and the agency within those communities, again, to serve themselves and to allow themselves the ability to change over time. So adding to, again, the brain and the hand, we have the heart, so having that appreciation. So with that in mind, this was a project where we really tried to prioritize that Hogan typology within the floor plan. The client for this project is the matriarch of the family, really, and what's appreciated within Navajo culture is that it is a matrilineal society. And it was really important for her to have these kind of traditional practices well represented. So here you can see again that wheel existing within the really open floor plan. They really did not want partition space, and so what you see in the bottom left is an area that's curtained off that could be a bed, but that cabinet could slide back into the built-ins to adjust to an open floor plan completely, and could be adaptable, so if they wanted to continue to build to the west, there was that possibility. So otherwise, all the utility cores are to the north. Additionally, you'll notice that there's a big overhang to the east, again, eastern-facing door. The idea here is that a typical client might, for ritual purposes, have many people come visit their house, but with a small floor plan, how do you create that opportunity? So it's really about in this case, creating this kind of overhang sheltered area that is to the outdoor, that leads to those possibilities happening to the outdoor. So just some other detail moments in this project. You'll see here a kind of a nice palette of materials that is sort of typical for us. You have white cedar that's been stained, some corrugated metal, and some plaster on the right here. Here's a nice shot too, where you get to see on the eastern side, just a little bit away from that canopy, a fire pit, which now that the space has been a bit more lived in and elaborated, oftentimes when we visit this house, there's always people, whether it's doing drumming there or just hanging out with the kids after school. Very protected western face. Again, wind is a big need to contend with in this region. And then you get the sense of that open floor plan inside. Wood stove is a typical source of heating for most families. And then you get that utility bar on the north. Here's just a quick shot of that sleeping space and that curtain detail. And the bathroom, again, you can see that same shower style that we took from Sol Rose with the trench chain. Again, this client is not in a wheelchair, but we felt it's important to consider aging in place. So it could be that eventually she might be, so we want to be building for that. Additionally, on this project, it was our first engagement with a nonprofit called Grid Alternatives, and we installed solar panels on the roof, which provide 100% of the power supply. It's a grid-tied system right now. There's some contention about, depending on who the power provider is, whether or not net metering is doable. So it's something that we're still working on, is figuring out some of these energy concerns. So to that point, looking towards the future, I think for us, it's not about importing, it's not about globalism, it's about localism. How can we facilitate the community by being members of the community, being active participants and citizens of that community? So here are some additional tenets that we've started to build for ourselves. So again, it's building that capacity, identifying appropriate materials, those that are local, being able to translate those voices of the community to upper bureaucracies or through grant funding. They're not always able to articulate for themselves that need and to get folks on the same page, but that starts with listening. And then, of course, emphasizing cultural identity, as I've talked about. So some additional partnerships here. Again, the Grid Alternatives I've already mentioned. We've also been working with the Navajo organization called Change Labs, which is about entrepreneurialism, really trying to bring capacity not only in the form of built infrastructure, but also through job creation. And this is Heather Fleming, who is the founder of that program. We take additional nods from other great Native-based programs like the North Cheyenne Basketball Clinic. And so we work with our elementary students in our local area. What was great about the basketball clinic as a precedent is that they used the sport, which was really popular among the youth, as a means to talk about other things, ideas of health. And because their parents would be there, and because kids who not necessarily they don't play basketball, but they like to go watch, they would also be there, so they could have broader conversations about the community by first beginning and focusing on and bringing attention to the youth. And so we do after-school mentorship with the local elementary school. We teach them, everything from plasterwork or just represent being an excited adult, mentor, an energetic person, and give them a sense of what the outside world is. Again, it's a requirement of our AmeriCorps that students do volunteer work, so this is just an added benefit for us. Also, we've been working with local nonprofits that represent the indigenous community, Diné-Bikéyah being one of those. Right now, they're in a struggle to secure a land area that's very close to us as part of a national monument. And so we don't want to be, of course, involved in those political advocacy issues, but we are supportive of trying to understand and work with grassroots movements that represent Native America in our region. And then finally, working with the town of Bluff, which is a combination of both Anglo and Native, to prioritize our landscape and to work with seniors. We have a really big senior population in the town of Bluff. So, we have worked in housing for a really long time, and I think in the last few years we started wondering, what's the possibility for doing more community-based projects or projects that don't benefit just a single family but have a broader impact. And so our first foray in this was to work with one of our chapters to develop their plans for tourism. So again, these are plans that they already had. And as you saw before, there's a New York Times article, really well published internationally, but the publications that we appreciate the most are the ones that are local. And so this is an article that was a cover of the Navajo Times, which is our local rag. And it shows this project, which we were really happy about. You can see the subtitle here is about developing the economic capacity of that region. So this project was 2 cabins that were prototypes for potentially many other cabins. The site is adjacent to the chapter, so they will manage it. And it's very modernistic kind of study in the cube and doing some subtractions there. It's a really simple space. One space has the single bed on the left, and then the space on the right has 2 loft spaces. So here's that single bed. Nice little bar there. And you can see on the right here there's a bed, and above that there's a bunk on this one. So we're really happy that a lot of the representatives locally from the Navajo community came for the unveiling of this project. They really took a lot of pride in it. The next community project that I'm going to show is the Cedar Hall. This is actually a space on our campus. We were feeling for a while that our campus was very inward looking and it didn't give a face to the street. Additionally, we needed the ability to have some overflow because at the moment we didn't have a really dedicated space to classroom and teaching and to doing the work of designing and building. So this was a kind of an opportunity for that. And then additionally, we wanted this space to be given as an option to community members so that they could use it. And so I'm really happy to say that in the last fall time period, we've had many different kinds of nonprofits from the area be involved and use the space, and they seem to really love it. So the floor plan, of course, is just really simple. It's just open. Those bars representative of seating and some partitions that are movable. that projection can happen, or pin-up, or dry erase writing. You'll also notice there's a spiral staircase that leads up to a rooftop deck patio that allows people to survey the area. So the material palette, again, like many of our previous projects, you can see really strongly we use natural materials as much as possible. Here's a plaster finish. This faceted funneling type shape is really about attracting entry into this main area. And then as you can see, as you go through the space and out the back of the space, it kind of opens up and dissolves more towards the campus. Here's a look at that spiral stair and big slider. 70% of this building was built from salvaged materials. There was a house that was deconstructed and then reconstructed into this building. Among that, there were some big glue lambs that we were a little dubious about using for structure, so students used for these stair treads. Here's a look at that upper deck, which again, you can view the whole town and see the Twin Rocks, which is an important land feature again in our area. And that big open floor plan, you can see nested inside that built-in is a partition. There's another one behind that. They're on casters and they roll out. Dry erase on either side of these sliding barn doors, and then they have a metal backing, so you can put magnets on them for pinup. This is on the open house day, and you can see it holds a lot of people. And then we had a group of Japanese students who came to do a workshop in the summer, and they built some benches on the outside and invited the Bluff Elementary students to come and hang out on it. So the last project I'm going to talk about here, with the last 5 minutes I have, is the Navajo Sweat Equity Project. That's the project that we're currently working on. It hasn't been completed yet, but the idea of sweat equity, which many of you might be familiar from Habitat for Humanity, is the idea that clients, especially clients who don't have access to funding, can instead use their own labor and toil as a form of contribution. And so the need for housing in Navajo is great. We're realistic that it's much greater than we can individually impact. To give you a practical example of that, talking to one of our chapter leaders, they stated that within the next 5 years they needed something like 200 housing. And again, if you multiply that by 110, it wouldn't necessarily work out exactly like that, but you can get the sense that that multiplier is a lot of houses. So we only do one per year, one building per year, and sometimes it's a community project. So again, trying to think about what's the broader impact. So our current client, this is the state of their previous house, which was not really well built to begin with. It got molded in, and the roof started to sag, and eventually this is what they're left with. So the person on the right there is Carmi Ray. She is our contact at Denahutso, and she's just been an amazing champion for the project. And I think additionally she's really helped us to appreciate or confirm some of the things that we're already working towards, which is not just, again, building the houses from a functional standpoint, but how can we bring back the traditional acts of building. So her real vision for this is that the clients are as much learning about their culture as they are learning about construction. And so in an effort to teach ourselves more about that, we worked with a Navajo architect named Geraldine Blackgoat, and she did a really incredible job of creating this booklet to help us and Navajo Housing Authority and other individuals who are working for Navajos to understand how they could better service the needs of that community. So in this diagram, she's talking a little bit about how the hogan, which is the ritualistic space, could fit within the house border or exist outside. Again, talking about eastern entrance and the importance of that. And talking a little bit about light from above or connection to sky. And more of that. Talking about palette of materials. And so the solution that the students came up with is just really taking a really basic approach. So on the left, you can see within these possible configurations how an individual box, you could think of a little bit like a micro home, not exactly a tiny house, a little bit bigger than that, that has a utility core and all the services embedded within it, could be combined with another box, and that this combination of boxes could create phasing over time. So here's a better sense of that phasing. On the bottom of this diagram, you can see from left to right that shed shape, building sort of a larger gable shape that could have areas for expansion. On the top, you'll notice that we're talking about building a concrete slab and then a stem wall on the bottom that would have an earthen floor. That would be an opportunity for sweat equity. Again, the private area would contain these core utilities, and the public would create flexible space. So again, these could be configured as a gable style or butterfly, or they could be even ultimately two sheds gang together. And then, through the material elaborations, really making sure that our clients understood how to phase over time, talking about what areas are load bearing or not, and how that expansion could happen. So giving really specific habitation studies for those kinds of phasing moving forward. So this is something that we're still in the midst of presenting to the Housing Authority, who's funding the project. But again, you can see from a constructability standpoint, really only 3 wall types that could be built on-site or off-site. It could be done with stick framing or SIPs. And again, finding opportunities for sweat equity that speak to traditional materials. Again, plasters, which we're really fond of, but also other materials that are easy to install and assemble. So this last slide is just for a sense of hopefulness, looking forward to the future. If you want to know more how to find us, you can look on our website. You can see all of our previous projects as well. You can follow our blog and see the student work in action. For the current year, they won't be starting that blog until about late January, but you can look at the previous years and just wait for the forthcoming. Otherwise, you can see all of our projects. Additionally, if you're on social media, we're on Instagram and Facebook. Just search DesignBuildBLUFF. And that's it. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Jose. That's amazing work. And I think both the quality of the design work and the quality of the graphics that explain the design work are, pretty extraordinary. And a lot of the questions and comments that came in during your presentation say exactly that. Thank you for first of all, for the great work, but also for the great presentation of the work.
Great.
So some of the specific questions that came in how much of the work is subcontracted to licensed contractors for areas like electrical, mechanical, etc.?
Yeah, so as I was saying before, really mostly it's inspection. The only area that we really actually bring a licensed contractor is in the electrical portion to bring all the wires to the panel. There's certain local code requirements around that, but otherwise, the students do the work, and then we usually hire a contractor to inspect to make sure the work is up to par.
Excellent. Another question is, since you're on native land, is there a building code that you need to follow?
Well, it depends on the chapter that you're working with. The Navajo Sweat Equity project, for example, is borrowing from their adjacent chapter, Kayenta. Kayenta uses 2006 International Residential Code, and then they have some supplemental codes. So certainly we use those codes whenever possible. I think the reasoning behind 2006, and someone might be able to correct me if I'm wrong on this, is that after that there is a need for sprinklers. And because access to utilities are so difficult, it makes sprinklers really challenging. So, we try to prioritize, again, building performance and health, safety, welfare. But, our approach could be different depending on whether or not those facilities are available.
Thank you. Are these projects free for the end user, or are the end users required to purchase the project from DesignBuildBLUFF?
Yeah, so we're serving in the same capacity that Navajo Housing Authority would, or the local chapters would. So I didn't speak very much about land ownership or property within Navajo. It's a little bit different than it is in the way that we're familiar with it. So at the risk of kind of going down a long spiral here. There's what's called a home site lease. And so that's a little area of property that the tribe allows someone to build on, but you don't. The people who are building on that don't own that property in the same way that we perceive that. So they couldn't put a lien on that property, for example. And so additionally with the housing, there's some sense that some of those housing costs are provided by the chapter. So typically a lot of our funding comes directly from the chapter. So when I'm sure there might be also the question about how we get our clients. And so, that is sort of similar. We work directly with the chapters. In the case of the Sweat Equity Project, for example, they have applications for 2, 3, and 5 bedroom houses. So we're building the prototype for the 2-bedroom, but it's all done pretty exclusively through the chapter. So the client in that case, they work with the chapter directly, whether it's by making sure all their sweat equity hours are there, or whether it's somehow doing some kind of lending through the chapter. But we don't have any direct exchange with the client. And the big reason for that too, aside from wanting to just follow the local ways of doing things, is that we don't want to get into a client, a professional kind of client relationship where there are certain expectations put on us to achieve. So we like to have a little bit of that distance on it. So, but I think the flip side of that, and something that we're appreciating, is the client needs to have some kind of engagement with the project, or else they don't have that same sense of empowerment and ownership. So it's a delicate balance, and I think we're just trying to improve on it year after year.
Thank you. So this question is how your buildings relate to the rest of the Navajo communities. And actually, that is a question. How do your buildings relate to the rest of the Navajo communities?
I guess, yeah, maybe it's a charged question. I don't know.
Yeah.
I think before I arrived, there was some critical feedback that maybe some of our earlier projects felt a little bit like, alien spacecraft that had landed, and if that sort of idea of connection is the question like a formal question, yeah, maybe there is the possibility that some of our buildings are a little bit different or odd, depending on your viewpoint. But I think we try to work really hard with the client to make sure that we are, satisfying their needs and that they're happy with it. So, ultimately, sometimes that's what we care about the most. I think it depends project to project. If you reflect on them, some of them are going to be ones that locals in general find a more attraction towards. But I think those are the same kinds of perceptions that you're going to run into in the professional marketplace as well. I think the main thing, as long as we're prioritizing cultural responsibility, I think we're doing our due diligence.
Thank you. Do you get visited by many other universities that have expressed interest in starting a similar program in their areas?
Sure. I think design build as a mode of practice, whether it's community design build or just teaching craft in general, seems to be a growing desire. Some of you listening may have attended an ACSA conference in Halifax, I think 2 or 3 years back, where the focus was on design build, and I was pleasantly surprised to see that almost every university at some level that is teaching architecture seems to have the desire or have some faculty member who's wanting to do, at least on the small end, some form of fabrication, and if not on the larger end, doing more full-scale stuff. I think the number of programs that actually do this level of scale repeatedly year after year is really small. You can count them probably on one hand. But yeah, I think there's general interest. Certainly the interest is there from the students. I get calls from all kinds of people. Aside from the graduate program, we do offer 2 spots for non-matriculating students, which is an application process, and those are very sought after, and I have a waiting list typically.
Nice. Do you do any energy modeling of the work prior to construction?
That is a big vacancy, and also I think we could do a better job of doing post-occupancy analysis. In terms of passive building, we're trying to avoid situations where we're requiring mechanical ventilation, again, because access to electricity and and other utilities are really difficult. So we don't mind a small bit of infiltration, but we do, the typical solar studies, things that don't require that extra level of computation. Obviously, we're doing that. But I think we could do a better job of it.
Thanks. And actually, the next question was about post-occupancy evaluation. I think you just answered that. So then there are a couple of questions about level change or lack of level change. So just to read these both, why is there an absence of level difference between inside and outside areas? And then maybe a comment on that. Since most of the units are built in a desert area with little greenery, there's bound to be desert insects and creatures crawling inside the living area because of the lack of level change.
Yeah, I have some comments. If you look back at some of our projects, we did have some of that. I think the biggest issue for us is just accessibility. So to pull back the Sol Rose example, right, we want to make sure that there is that ability for aging in place. I would say more than the concern for insects and animals is the concern for wind. Wind does build up a lot of sand. And so there is that sort of maintenance requirement. The concrete slab as the final finish does allow for easy cleaning. But yeah, I think, just trying to temper our ambition and, we've looked at peer foundations, even on this most recent Tenahota Sweat Equity project, but, concrete slab is really the thing that is the most requested, and I think it's the most affordable, and I think for a lot of different reasons we tend to like working with the slab. And so then that would mean the possibility, I guess, that we could obviously build that up. But it's just, it's been what's worked for us, I suppose. But yeah, if you look back in our previous project, you'll see the White Horse project as being one that was raised up on piers.
Yeah. Thank you. How is water provided, and what's the sanitary system?
So in terms of our requirement, typically in our MOUs with the chapters, we are pretty explicit about the fact that we're not providing utilities. We describe the house as the house box, right? And so we are just providing that, and we stub out. It depends how close the house is to any kind of built infrastructure. If there isn't, then it's typically provided, from my understanding, through a cistern, and that cistern that's filled. If you spend any time in Navajo, you'll notice a lot of people haul water. They truck it around, and it's I think been a growing area of interest for us to research not only the energy stuff that I talked a little bit more at length about, but also the water utility kinds of questions. But most of it's just hauled, and that's just the typical life that a lot of people of this region face. I think more and more funders that are from the tribal area are trying to get us into a situation where we're building closer with more density, or trying to only choose those clients that are choosing home sites that are closer to density. But that runs a little bit in the face of cultural tradition, where historically Navajo have not always lived in that way. And so I think we're trying to avoid, on the flip side, creating suburbs in the desert. So I think it's an ongoing internal debate, which I have some personal opinions about here and there, but I won't go too deep into them, other than to just say, we try to work with it kind of case by case.
Thanks so much. So we are just about out of time, so I think I'll read one last comment that came in, and it's not a question, it's a comment, which I think, I definitely share. In short, the whole project planning and functional usefulness is incredible and inspiring. Thank you so much. So with that, I will thank you so much, Jose, and then we have a few closing slides here for the folks that are participating in the webinar. And this really has to do with the way that participants will get credit. And so I'm just waiting for the slide to come up on the screen. So hang on one sec. Thank you, Jose. We've done the questions. So this is more information about other AIA webinars. Some of you had sent in questions as how do you get the PDF of this, or how do you get the actual video of this. So go to the link that's on the screen right now, or simply Google AIA webinars, and you should find it. There is a webinar survey report form that you will get in a follow-up email, so make sure that you fill out that survey. And let's see, that might be the last of the slides. So with that, again, thank you so much, Jose, and thank you to everyone else for logging in today. So just for your information, the next of these AIA Housing Knowledge Community webinars will be the first Monday in February at 12 o'clock Eastern Time. So thank you again for participating, and thanks so much, Jose.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Bye-bye.